Hello everyone, welcome to Cursed Chronicles, and I'm here to help you unwind tonight. I know many of you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot. Now get comfortable, relax, and let the sound of the rain guide you as we dive into tonight's stories. Sweet dreams, or perhaps something more chilling, awaits. The bus creaked to a stop, its engine sputtering, as if protesting against the idea of venturing further into this forsaken place. Elena stepped out first, her boots crunching against the gravel as her eyes scanned the empty expanse of Black Hollow. A town erased from most maps, cloaked in whispers of disappearances and ghostly apparitions. The air here was thick, almost suffocating, carrying a metallic tang that made her stomach churn. Behind her, the rest of the group descended reluctantly. Simon, the skeptic, armed with a flashlight, Mia, clutching a camcorder with trembling fingers, and Marcus, who seemed to regret agreeing to this urban exploration trip in the first place. The town stood as a skeletal shadow of its former self. Rusting street signs pointed to nowhere, and storefronts sat hollowed out, their broken windows resembling jagged teeth. A clock tower loomed at the town's center, its hands frozen at 3:13, a time that sent a shiver down Elena's spine for reasons she couldn't explain. "This place looks wrong," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible over the low, unnatural hum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. As they walked further in, the group noticed the strange markings etched into the walls, symbols that twisted and turned in impossible ways, almost as if they were alive. "Probably graffiti," Simon scoffed, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. The sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows that seemed to reach out for them. The oppressive silence was broken only by the faint sound of footsteps, too faint to belong to any of them. They exchanged nervous glances, their unease growing with every step. They decided to make their base in what looked like an old inn, its door hanging askew and its sign barely legible, The Hollow Rest. Inside, the air was colder, and the scent of mildew mixed with something far worse, something metallic and sickly sweet. As they explored the inn, they found more of the strange symbols, along with unsettling remnants of the past. A child's shoe, a shattered porcelain doll, and a diary whose pages had been blackened and charred. The entries that were legible spoke of voices in the night, whispers that lured people into the woods. "I don't like this," Marcus muttered, his voice cracking. None of them did. But what unnerved Elena most wasn't the objects or the symbols. It was the mirror in the corner of the room. It was perfectly intact, its surface unnaturally pristine, and as she gazed into it, she could swear she saw movement that didn't belong to any of them. A flicker of something tall, gaunt, and watching. When she turned, nothing was there. "We'll just spend the night and leave at first light," Simon declared, trying to sound authoritative. But as night fell, the town seemed to come alive in ways none of them could have imagined. The hum grew louder, morphing into a low, droning chant that seemed to rise from beneath the earth itself. Shadows moved where there was no light, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. Elena felt it first, the cold, bony hand that brushed against her shoulder, though no one was near. And then came the knocking, slow and deliberate, from deep within the inn's walls. As the group settled into the decrepit inn for the night, a suffocating tension hung in the air, making even the most mundane tasks, unpacking sleeping bags, setting up flashlights, feel insurmountable. The inn's silence wasn't just still, it was oppressive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Mia fiddled nervously with her camcorder, aiming it toward the hallway where the shadows seemed to pulse unnaturally. Simon sat by the broken fireplace, pretending to be engrossed in his notebook, though he hadn't written a single word. "It's just a town," he muttered, breaking the silence. "Nothing here but our imaginations running wild." But the words rang hollow, especially as the faint sound of scratching began to echo from somewhere above them. They exchanged glances, the tension in the room thick enough to choke. "Probably rats," Marcus offered weakly, his eyes darting toward the ceiling. Elena wasn't so sure. The scratching was rhythmic, deliberate, like nails being dragged across wood with measured intent. The group tried to ignore it, hoping it would fade, but the sound grew louder, shifting positions as though something was crawling through the walls, something larger than rats. The clock in the hallway struck 3:13. It hadn't worked in decades, but the chime rang out with a clarity that sent shivers down their spines. The temperature in the room plummeted. Elena could see her breath fogging up in the dim light, and the metallic tang in the air intensified. "Do you feel that?" Mia whispered, clutching her camcorder as if it were a talisman. No one needed to answer. The oppressive cold was undeniable. Then came the knocking. It started softly, a faint tap-tap-tap from the inn's main door. Simon stood, trying to act brave. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, though his voice betrayed him. He moved toward the door, but Elena grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said firmly. "Whatever it is, it doesn't want us to open that door." The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the floorboards. The group huddled together, their flashlights darting toward every corner of the room. Shadows danced on the walls, but it was the absence of shadow in one corner that caught Elena's eye. There, amidst the flickering beams, stood a figure, tall and impossibly gaunt, its face obscured by an unnatural blur, like a smudge on a photograph. She blinked, and it was gone. "Did you see that?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. Before anyone could respond, Mia's camcorder began to whir, its lens adjusting on its own as if something unseen was moving in front of it. She pointed it toward the hallway, and the screen flickered with static before displaying the same gaunt figure Elena had just seen. Only now it was closer. The screen went dark, and the camcorder let out a shrill screech before falling silent. "I'm not staying here," Marcus blurted, heading for the door, but as he reached for the handle, it turned on its own. The door creaked open slowly, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Not the night sky, not the distant outline of the town, just an endless void that seemed to stretch into eternity. A chilling wind blew through the opening, carrying with it a faint whisper that none of them could decipher. Marcus froze, his hand trembling as he stepped back. The door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire inn, and the sound of a deep, resonant laugh echoed from the walls. The scratching above them intensified, now accompanied by a series of thuds, as though something heavy was moving across the ceiling. Dust rained down as the beams groaned under the weight. "Upstairs," Simon said, his voice cracking. "Whatever it is, it's upstairs." Against their better judgment, they climbed the creaking staircase, the flashlights casting long, jittery beams ahead of them. The second floor was worse than the first. The walls were covered in the same twisting symbols they had seen earlier, but now they seemed to shimmer faintly, as if pulsing with some dark energy. Doors lined the hallway, each one slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of what lay inside. Rooms filled with shattered furniture, broken glass, and something else. Shadows that moved even when the flashlight beams held steady. At the end of the hall was a single door, pristine and untouched, with no markings. Elena reached for the handle, but before her fingers could make contact, the door swung open. The room beyond was a perfect mirror of the one they had just left downstairs, except for one detail. In the corner stood a figure, identical to Elena. It had her face, her clothes, even the same streak of dirt smudged across her cheek, but its eyes were black voids. It smiled at her, a slow, unnatural grin that stretched too wide. The group froze, their minds unable to comprehend what they were seeing. And then the thing moved. It didn't walk, it glided, closing the distance between them in an instant. Elena screamed, and the figure stopped abruptly, tilting its head as if curious. "Leave," it said, its voice layered with dozens of others, some whispering, others screaming. "Leave before it takes you." The group didn't wait to be told twice. They bolted down the stairs, the sound of pounding footsteps behind them growing louder with every step. They burst out of the inn into the freezing night, but the horror wasn't confined to the building. The entire town had changed. The streets twisted unnaturally, looping back on themselves, and the clock tower now loomed impossibly tall, its frozen hands glowing faintly. Worse, the low hum had returned, accompanied by faint voices chanting in an unknown language. As they ran, Mia tripped, her camcorder skittering across the ground. She scrambled to grab it, but as she did, she caught a glimpse of something through the lens. Figures, dozens of them, standing just beyond the edges of the flashlight beams. They were watching, waiting. Marcus pulled her to her feet, and they all sprinted toward what they thought was the edge of town. But the path only brought them back to the inn. Panting and terrified, they stood in front of the building, its windows glowing faintly with an eerie red light. "We're trapped," Elena whispered, the realization hitting her like a blow to the chest. "They won't let us leave." They had no choice but to retreat into the inn, though every instinct screamed against it. The building seemed to breathe as they crossed the threshold, the wood groaning and the walls almost imperceptibly pulsing, like the rhythm of a heart. Inside, the air was heavier, suffused with a smell they couldn't quite identify, decay mixed with something acrid, chemical. Marcus slammed the door shut, locking the bolt, though deep down, they all knew a lock wouldn't keep anything out. Or in. The group collapsed into silence, huddled in the corner of the main room. their flashlights flickering weakly. "I don't think we're dealing with ghosts," Simon said after a long pause, his voice low, almost reverent. This is something else." His words hung in the air, uncomfortably heavy. Mia, who hadn't stopped shaking since they fled the upstairs room, muttered, "We need to figure out how to get out of here. There's got to be a way." But even as she said it, her eyes darted toward the windows, where the town had become a labyrinth of impossible angles and shifting shadows. It was clear now that Black Hollow wasn't just a place, it was alive. As the night wore on, the group's grip on reality began to slip. The first signs were subtle. Marcus swore he heard his mother calling his name from outside, though she had been dead for 5 years. He pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear, his eyes wide and unblinking. "She's out there," he whispered. "She's waiting for me." Elena had to physically pull him back, and when he turned to face her, his eyes looked wrong, glassy, distant, as if he were staring through her rather than at her. Mia, meanwhile, became fixated on the camcorder. She rewound the tape over and over, replaying the brief glimpse of the figures she had captured outside. But with each viewing, the figures were closer, clearer, their faces becoming distinct and horrifying. They were grotesque parodies of humanity, their features distorted, their mouths stretched into grins too wide for their faces. "They're watching us," Mia whispered, clutching the camcorder like a lifeline. "They're always watching." Simon tried to stay grounded, scribbling frantic notes in his notebook. He muttered theories under his breath, about dimensional rifts, ancient rituals, collective hallucinations, but his words became increasingly incoherent. "The symbols," he said, tapping the notebook with a trembling finger. "They're a language, a warning maybe, or an invitation." He trailed off, his eyes darting to the walls where the markings seemed to move subtly, as if writhing under the surface of the wood. It was Elena who noticed the mirror first. It had been in the corner of the room since they arrived, but now its surface wasn't reflecting their surroundings. Instead, it showed something else entirely. The inn as it might have been decades ago, alive with people who weren't quite right. They moved jerkily, their faces blurred, their eyes black voids like the figure upstairs. In the mirror, the group saw themselves standing in the room, but their reflections were wrong, pale, gaunt, with blackened eyes and twisted smiles. "Turn it away," Elena said, her voice trembling. But when she tried to move it, the mirror wouldn't budge, as if it had fused to the floor. The hum returned, louder now, reverberating through their bodies and making their teeth ache. It was punctuated by whispers, hundreds of them, coming from every direction, speaking in a language none of them understood. Elena pressed her hands over her ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were inside her head, digging into her thoughts. She looked around at the others and saw the same terror mirrored in their expressions. "It's in our minds," she realized, her voice barely audible. "It's trying to break us." The boundaries between reality and illusion began to blur. The inn's layout shifted when they weren't looking, doors appearing and disappearing, hallways stretching longer than they should. At one point, Simon opened a door he swore led to the kitchen, only to find himself staring into a void of infinite darkness. He closed it quickly, but not before something within the void whispered his name, sending him reeling back in panic. Marcus grew increasingly unstable, pacing the room and muttering to himself. "We're already dead," he said at one point, his eyes wide with fear. "This is hell. We died on the way here, and this is where we ended up." No one could convince him otherwise. When the sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs, slow, deliberate, heavier than human, he snapped. "I can't do this anymore," he shouted, grabbing a chair and smashing it against the wall. "Come and get me," he screamed at the ceiling, his voice cracking. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then came the laughter, deep, guttural, and mocking, reverberating through the inn. It sounded like it came from everywhere at once. Marcus froze, his face pale, his hands trembling. "It's playing with us," Mia said, her voice a hushed whisper. "It's feeding off us." Elena began to see things in the corner of her vision, shadowy figures that disappeared the moment she turned her head. She felt the cold touch of fingers brushing against her arm, though no one was near her. At one point, she thought she saw her own reflection in the window, though she wasn't standing anywhere near it. The reflection stared at her with hollow eyes, mouthing words she couldn't hear. The group was unraveling, their sanity fraying with each passing moment. Mia refused to let go of the camcorder, muttering about documenting the truth, even as her hands shook so badly she could barely hold it steady. Simon's notebook devolved into meaningless scribbles, the symbols from the walls replicated obsessively on every page. Marcus sat in the corner, rocking back and forth, whispering apologies to someone who wasn't there. And then the knocking returned. This time it came from every wall, every door, every window, a cacophony that made the room tremble. The whispers grew louder, merging into a deafening roar. The mirror in the corner shattered, and for a brief moment, Elena saw something on the other side, a sprawling, grotesque landscape filled with writhing figures and endless darkness. She turned away, but the image burned itself into her mind. The group was paralyzed, trapped in a waking nightmare with no way out. And as the clock struck 3:13 again, its chime impossibly loud, drowning out the knocking and the whispers, they realized the inn wasn't just a part of the town. It was the town, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The room seemed to buckle under an unseen pressure as the final chime of the clock tower reverberated through the inn. The knocking ceased, but the silence that followed was worse, thick and suffocating, filled with an unbearable tension that made the air feel like a living, watching thing. Mia gripped the camcorder tightly, her breathing shallow, her wide eyes darting around the room. Marcus sat frozen, his lips moving silently, mouthing words that made no sense. Simon and Elena stood back to back, their flashlights scanning the shadows that writhed at the edges of the room. And then it happened. The floorboards in the center of the room groaned, the wood splintering as though under immense weight. A crack snaked its way across the floor, oozing a viscous, black substance that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The substance moved unnaturally, pooling into a perfect circle that pulsed like a beating heart. A low, guttural sound emerged from the blackness, a noise that was less a growl and more a vibration, deep and resonant, shaking their bones and rattling their teeth. "No," Elena whispered, stepping back as the circle began to expand, devouring the floor around it. The black ooze was alive, rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. From its depths, something began to emerge, a figure rising slowly, unnaturally, as though it were being pulled from another world. The group could do nothing but watch, paralyzed by a primal fear that froze their bodies and silenced their screams. The thing that rose from the blackness was tall, impossibly so, its head brushing the ceiling, though its form seemed to shift and ripple like smoke. Its body was skeletal, its limbs too long, its joints bending at unnatural angles. It was cloaked in darkness, its edges indistinct, as though its very presence defied the rules of reality. And its face, or what passed for a face, was the worst of all. It had no eyes, no nose, only a gaping mouth that stretched across its head, filled with jagged teeth that seemed to shift and change like the rest of it. As the entity fully emerged, the black ooze receded, absorbed back into the cracks it had come from. The room was silent again, save for the sound of their breathing, rapid, shallow, and terrified. The entity stood motionless, its head tilted as though studying them. Then it moved, gliding forward without taking a step, its presence filling the room like a physical weight. Simon was the first to speak, though his voice was barely a whisper. What do you want?" His question hung in the air, unanswered. The entity didn't speak, it didn't need to. Its presence was an answer in itself, an overwhelming sense of dread and inevitability, of something ancient and incomprehensible. The whispers returned, louder now, but they didn't come from the walls. They came from the entity itself, its gaping mouth remaining still as the voices echoed from its form. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, speaking in unison, their words layered and incomprehensible. Elena clutched her head, the sound burrowing into her mind like nails. She could feel it inside her thoughts, prying them apart, exposing every fear and regret she had ever buried. Mia raised her camcorder, the lens trembling as she tried to focus on the entity. The screen flickered violently, displaying not the room but something else, a vast, alien landscape filled with spires of black stone and rivers of glowing red. The camcorder began to overheat, smoke rising from its casing, but Mia couldn't look away. It's not from here," she stammered, her voice trembling. "It's not from anywhere." The entity's attention shifted to her, and for a moment she froze. Its form rippled, the whispers growing louder, more aggressive. Mia screamed, dropping the camcorder as blood began to drip from her nose and ears. The device shattered on the floor, its final image burned into the screen. The entity's face, distorted and grinning. Marcus snapped. "We have to fight it," he yelled, grabbing a broken chair leg and rushing at the entity. But as he swung, the wood disintegrated midair, crumbling to ash before it could make contact. The entity didn't move, didn't react, but Marcus was flung backward as though struck by an invisible force, slamming into the wall with a sickening crack. He slumped to the ground, unconscious, or worse. Elena felt the weight of the entity's gaze turn to her, though it had no eyes. It didn't need them. She felt it probing her mind, pulling at her memories, dredging up images she had tried to forget. The car accident that had killed her sister, the months of guilt and blame, the nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering if she should have been the one to die. The entity fed on it, its form growing more defined, more solid, as though her suffering was a feast it couldn't resist. Simon grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her back as the entity began to move closer. "We need to get out of here," he hissed, his voice frantic. But there was nowhere to go. Every door they tried led back to the same room, and the windows showed nothing but darkness. The inn was no longer a building. It was a trap, a cage designed to keep them in and feed them to the thing that had emerged. The symbols on the walls began to glow, pulsing in time with the entity's movements. Simon stared at them, his mind racing. "The markings," he muttered. "They're part of it. They're keeping it here, binding it." His hands trembled as he traced the lines with his fingers. "If we destroy them..." Before he could finish, the entity let out a sound, a deep, resonant roar that shook the walls and sent Elena to her knees. The air grew heavier, pressing down on them like a physical force. Simon screamed, clutching his chest as blood seeped from his nose and mouth. He fell to the floor, convulsing, his body contorted in unnatural ways. Elena and Mia were the only ones left standing, their breaths ragged, their minds teetering on the edge of collapse. The entity loomed over them, its form now solid, its grin impossibly wide. "Why us?" Elena managed to whisper, tears streaming down her face. The entity didn't answer, but she felt its intention. They were here because they had come, because they had dared to enter its domain. The whispers grew louder, deafening, as the room seemed to collapse inward, the walls closing in, the floor buckling. The last thing Elena saw before everything went dark was the entity reaching out, its long, skeletal fingers brushing against her face. When Elena woke, the air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and something more ancient, more primal. She was lying on the cold, splintered floor of the inn, her body aching as though she had been crushed under an enormous weight. Mia was beside her, unconscious but alive, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. The room was dimly lit, the glow of the symbols on the walls pulsating faintly, casting distorted shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Marcus and Simon were gone. The thought sent a jolt of panic through her, and she scrambled to her feet, the world spinning around her. She called their names, her voice hoarse and cracking, but the only response was the low hum that now seemed to emanate from every surface. The inn was alive, its walls vibrating with a barely contained energy, and she felt it watching her, judging her. Mia stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Elena," she croaked, her voice barely audible. Where are they?" Elena shook her head, unable to form an answer. She helped Mia to her feet, and together they surveyed the room. The symbols on the walls were no longer static. They writhed and twisted, forming new shapes that burned themselves into Elena's mind the longer she looked at them. They weren't just markings. They were instructions, a language that defied comprehension but communicated nonetheless. "They're gone," Mia said, her voice trembling. "It took them." Elena wanted to deny it, to cling to some shred of hope, but deep down, she knew Mia was right. The entity had taken them, and if they didn't figure out a way to stop it, they would be next. As they moved through the inn, searching for any clue, any weapon, they noticed the changes. The layout was shifting again, the hallways elongating, doors appearing where there had been none. The air grew colder, their breath visible in the dim light, and the whispers returned, soft at first, but growing louder with every step. They weren't random anymore. They were coherent, repeating a single phrase over and over. "The truth is buried." Elena and Mia found themselves in a room they hadn't seen before, its walls covered in the same glowing symbols. But these were different, more intricate, more deliberate. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a book, its cover made of a leathery material that felt wrong to the touch. The pages were brittle, the text written in the same shifting language as the symbols on the walls. Mia hesitated, her hands trembling as she turned the pages. The text seemed to rearrange itself, forming words she could understand. The binding must hold. The vessel must be sealed. "It's a ritual," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This place, it's a prison. The entity is trapped here, but the bindings are weakening." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "And we're the ones who broke them," she said, realization dawning. "By coming here, by disturbing this place, we set it free." The book contained detailed instructions for the ritual, but it was far from straightforward. They needed to recreate the symbols in specific patterns, using materials that were described only in vague terms. Blood, ash, and something referred to as the essence of fear. They didn't know what it meant, but they knew they didn't have much time. As they read, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The inn began to shake, the walls bending inward as though the building itself were collapsing. The entity was coming, and it wasn't going to give them the chance to stop it. "We need to hurry," Elena said, grabbing the book and pulling Mia toward the door. But the inn had other plans. The door slammed shut, and the walls began to bleed, the black ooze seeping from every crack, pooling on the floor and rising like smoke. The entity's presence was suffocating, its form emerging from the shadows, towering over them. Its mouth twisted into a grin that seemed to stretch forever, and the whispers stopped, replaced by a single deafening voice. "You cannot bind me again." Mia screamed, clutching the book to her chest as the entity reached for her. Elena acted on instinct, grabbing a shard of broken glass from the floor and slashing at her own palm. Blood dripped onto the floor, and as it touched the glowing symbols, they flared brighter, the light driving the entity back momentarily. "It's working!" Elena shouted, though she wasn't sure if she was convincing Mia or herself. "We have to complete the ritual." They scrambled to recreate the symbols from the book, using Elena's blood and the ash they scraped from the edges of the fireplace. The process was chaotic, their hands shaking, the entity looming ever closer. It didn't attack directly, but its presence was overwhelming, its whispers burrowing into their minds, dredging up memories and fears they had tried to bury. Mia hesitated as she drew one of the final symbols, her face pale. "It's showing me," she trailed off, tears streaming down her face. "It's showing me my dad. He's here. He's alive. It's lying." Elena yelled, grabbing Mia's arm and pulling her back. "It's not real. Focus." The entity roared, its form shifting violently, the room darkening as it surged toward them. They finished the final symbol just as it reached them, its skeletal fingers brushing against Elena's face. The symbols flared to life, and the entity screamed, a sound that shook the inn to its foundations, a sound of pure, unbridled rage. The room was filled with light, blinding and all-consuming. Elena and Mia shielded their eyes, their bodies trembling as the entity was pulled back, its form disintegrating, dissolving into the black ooze that retreated into the cracks of the floor. The whispers faded, the room growing still. For a moment, there was silence. Then the walls began to crumble, the inn collapsing around them. Elena and Mia stumbled through the collapsing inn, the walls groaning and splintering around them, as though the very fabric of the building was being torn apart. Every step was a struggle, the ground buckling beneath their feet, threatening to pull them down into the black abyss that oozed and writhed beneath the floorboards. The glowing symbols that had once lined the walls flickered and died, leaving them in near-total darkness, lit only by the faint glow of Mia's flashlight, which she clutched like a lifeline. The entity was gone, or at least it seemed to be. Its screams had ceased, and the oppressive weight of its presence had lifted, but the air was still heavy with dread. Elena could feel it, lingering just beneath the surface, watching them, waiting for a moment of weakness. She knew the ritual had worked, but she also knew the binding was fragile. The entity wasn't truly gone. It was contained, barely, and the inn itself was falling apart under the strain of holding it. "We have to move," Elena said, her voice strained as she pulled Mia toward the doorway. The hall beyond was unrecognizable, warped and twisted, with door frames leading to nowhere and staircases spiraling into darkness. The inn had become a labyrinth, a maze of shifting corridors designed to keep them trapped. Mia hesitated, glancing back at the room where they had performed the ritual. "What about Simon and Marcus?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They're gone," Elena said, the words catching in her throat. She didn't want to believe it, but deep down, she knew it was true. The entity had taken them, consumed them, and there was no bringing them back. "We have to go, Mia. If we stay, we'll end up like them." The sound of splintering would echo through the hallway, followed by a low, guttural growl that made the hairs on the back of Elena's neck stand on end. The entity might have been bound, but it wasn't going to let them leave without a fight. The inn itself was turning against them, the walls closing in, the floor splitting open to reveal gaping chasms of darkness. Elena grabbed Mia's hand, dragging her forward as the hallway behind them collapsed, swallowed by the encroaching blackness. They ran blindly, their footsteps echoing through the shifting corridors, the air thick with dust and the acrid smell of burning wood. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with every step, overlapping voices speaking in a language that made Elena's head throb. "This way!" Mia shouted, pulling Elena toward a staircase that seemed to lead upward, though its destination was obscured by shadows. They climbed as fast as they could, the steps creaking and groaning beneath their weight. Behind them, the black ooze seeped through the cracks in the walls, creeping closer with every passing second. At the top of the stairs, they found themselves in what remained of the inn's main foyer. The grand chandelier that had once hung above the entrance lay shattered on the floor, its crystals scattered like broken stars. The front doors were gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Mia froze, her grip on Elena's hand tightening. "How do we get out?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the building collapsing around them. Elena scanned the room, her mind racing. The vortex was blocking the exit, and the windows were bricked over, as though the inn itself was determined to keep them trapped. Then she noticed something, the faint outline of a doorway on the far side of the room, partially hidden behind a collapsed beam. It wasn't the front door, it was smaller, more nondescript, but it was the only way out. "There," Elena said, pointing to the doorway. They ran toward it, dodging falling debris and jumping over gaping holes in the floor. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and Elena could feel the entity's anger, its desperation to keep them from escaping. As they reached the doorway, a surge of black ooze erupted from the floor, blocking their path. The ooze twisted and writhed, forming into a grotesque shape, a mockery of a human form, with elongated limbs and a gaping mouth that dripped with the same viscous black liquid. It wasn't the entity itself, but a fragment of it, a piece of its essence given form. Elena pushed Mia behind her, grabbing a piece of broken wood from the floor. "Go," she said, her voice firm despite the terror coursing through her veins. "I'll hold it off." "No," Mia protested, her eyes wide with fear. "I'm not leaving you. We don't have time to argue," Elena shouted, swinging the makeshift weapon at the ooze. It passed through harmlessly, the black substance reforming instantly, but it bought Mia a few precious seconds to scramble through the doorway. The creature lunged at Elena, its claw-like hands swiping at her face. She dodged, barely, the force of the attack sending her stumbling backward. Her foot caught on a loose floorboard, and she fell, landing hard on her back. The creature loomed over her, its mouth opening impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, shifting teeth. Before it could strike, Mia reappeared, clutching the book they had taken from the ritual room. She opened it, her fingers frantically flipping through the pages until she found the one she was looking for. The text glowed faintly, and she began to read, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. The creature recoiled, its form flickering and distorting as though the words were burning it. Elena scrambled to her feet, grabbing Mia's arm and pulling her toward the doorway as the creature dissolved into a pool of black ooze. They burst through the doorway and found themselves outside, the cold night air hitting them like a slap to the face. The inn loomed behind them, its windows glowing faintly as it continued to collapse. They ran as far as they could, not stopping until they reached the treeline. When they turned back, the inn was gone. The clearing where it had stood was empty, the ground scorched and blackened, as though the building had been erased from existence. The whispers were gone, the air still and silent, but the weight of what they had experienced lingered. Mia collapsed to her knees, clutching the book to her chest. "It's over," she said, though her voice was hollow. Elena wasn't so sure. She could still feel the entity's presence, faint but undeniable, like a splinter buried deep beneath her skin. The ritual had worked, but at a cost. The inn might have been destroyed, but the entity wasn't gone. It was still bound, but the binding was weak, and it would only be a matter of time before it found a way to escape again. As they sat in the dark forest, the weight of their ordeal finally sinking in, Elena knew one thing for certain. They had survived, but they hadn't won. And somewhere, in the endless void where the entity now resided, it was watching. Waiting. On a particularly stormy night, Evelyn, a young woman in her late 20s, found herself driving down an old, forgotten road that wound through an eerie stretch of woodland. She had been traveling for hours, her headlights illuminating only the road ahead and the occasional silhouette of the trees that seemed to stretch endlessly on either side. The sky was a chaotic mixture of dark clouds that rippled in every direction, the sound of thunder constantly rumbling overhead. Her car, an old sedan that had seen better days, was beginning to struggle on the increasingly rough road. A sudden screech of tires as she swerved to avoid a massive branch falling from the trees jolted her back into focus. She had heard of an old village nearby, a place that wasn't on many maps, but it was a perfect pit stop to rest before continuing her journey. The village was said to be abandoned, its residents long gone, or at least, that's what the locals in the last town she passed had told her. However, The thought of exploring the mystery piqued her curiosity. Evelyn had always been drawn to places that seemed forgotten by time. She had no idea what she would find there, but she was excited at the prospect of uncovering something hidden, something lost. The rain grew heavier as she approached the entrance to the village, the road narrowing into a single track, flanked by towering trees whose branches intertwined above her, blocking out the few fleeting rays of moonlight. She didn't expect to see much of anything as she entered the village, only the rusted, creaking signs marking the boundaries of the place. It looked like any other small, abandoned town, old houses, windows boarded up, doors hanging off their hinges, and weeds overgrowing the pavement. But there was something in the air that felt wrong, something that made Evelyn's skin crawl despite the fact that everything seemed so still. The town felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She pulled her car into the village center, her headlights cutting through the mist that had begun to roll in. The cobblestone streets looked untouched, as if the world outside had never moved here, time itself unwilling to break the silence. Evelyn stepped out of her car, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots sounding unnervingly loud in the stillness. She didn't know why, but she had an overwhelming sense of being watched, of not being alone, even though the village appeared empty. The air was thick with a dampness that clung to her clothes, and a coldness seemed to seep into her very bones, as though the land itself had a chill that was beyond the weather. As she walked down the main street, the wind began to howl, the trees groaning above her like they were whispering secrets she wasn't meant to hear. She looked at the nearby buildings, decaying houses with broken windows, abandoned stores with their faded signage peeling off the walls. She found herself drawn to a particularly large, stone building at the center of the village, a church, or at least what used to be one. The architecture was old, with tall, narrow windows and a steeple that seemed to pierce the sky itself. A heavy iron door stood ajar, creaking softly with every gust of wind. Evelyn, against her better judgment, pushed the door open. Inside, the church was even more unsettling. The air was thick, musty with the smell of old wood and mildew. The pews were still lined up neatly in rows, but they were covered in dust, as if no one had been there in years, decades maybe. The altar, once a place of reverence, was now covered in layers of cobwebs. Yet, despite the decay, there was an undeniable presence in the room, a heaviness that clung to the very walls. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She could almost feel something moving just beyond her vision, something she couldn't quite place. The storm outside grew more intense, and Evelyn's mind began to race. She could leave, go back to her car, and continue on her way. But something inside her, some primal curiosity, refused to let her go. She knew she should turn around and drive away, but the village seemed to have a strange hold on her. Every step she took seemed to echo louder in the vast emptiness of the church, every movement heavier. The door slammed shut behind her, as though pushed by an unseen force. Evelyn spun around, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was colder now, the darkness more oppressive, as though the shadows had grown longer since she entered. At that moment, Evelyn felt something she couldn't explain, an overwhelming sense of dread. Her mind screamed at her to leave, but her body refused to obey. She stumbled forward, her hand reaching out to touch the altar, as though something invisible was drawing her closer. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the sound of something, footsteps, broke the stillness. She turned, heart racing, but saw nothing. Yet, she felt it. The presence was there, in the very air around her, watching, waiting. And that's when she heard it, soft at first, then growing louder, a whispering voice carried on the wind that howled through the broken windows of the church. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone was unmistakable, filled with malice and sorrow. Evelyn took a hesitant step backward, her mind screaming for her to run. But the air grew thicker, the whispers louder, until it felt like they were closing in around her, suffocating her with their weight. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The whispers faded, the chill lifted, and the world seemed to settle into a tense stillness that made her blood run cold. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she stood frozen in the church, the silence around her thick and oppressive. The feeling of being watched hadn't dissipated, and a cold sweat began to bead on her forehead. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the creaky wooden door, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to have settled around her. But as she tried to pull it open, the door refused to budge, as though some invisible force was holding it shut. Panic surged through her as she tugged harder, but nothing happened. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and for the first time since her arrival, she realized just how trapped she was. In that moment of helplessness, a soft, Distant sound reached her ears, footsteps, slow and deliberate, approaching from the back of the church. Her body froze, every instinct screaming at her to hide, to run, but her legs refused to obey. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until Evelyn's eyes were drawn unwillingly toward the source of the sound. There, in the shadowed corner of the room, stood a figure. The figure was indistinct at first, a vague outline in the dim light, but as it moved into the faint glow of the broken windows, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It was a man, but his features were obscured by a dark hood, and his figure seemed almost too thin, as though it were made from shadows themselves. He moved with a strange, unnatural grace, his body seeming to glide rather than walk, his movements jerky and disjointed. Evelyn's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The figure didn't seem human. There was something wrong about it, something wrong about the way it was standing there, unmoving, just watching her. Evelyn took a step back, her heart pounding, but the figure didn't approach. Instead, it simply stood like a sentinel, observing her with an unnerving stillness. In that silence, the air around her seemed to grow heavier, colder, and she knew instinctively that this was not just a person. This was something far worse. She couldn't look away, even though every fiber of her being screamed at her to run. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if studying her, and Evelyn felt a shiver crawl up her spine. Then, without warning, the figure spoke, its voice low and gravelly, like it hadn't been used in years. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its words echoing in the church. Evelyn's throat went dry, her legs finally able to move as she stumbled backward, her mind racing. Who was this person? How did they know she had just arrived? But before she could form another thought, the figure raised a hand, and she froze, her entire body locked in place as though some invisible force had seized her. The figure spoke again, this time with an air of finality. "Leave. Now, or you will join the others." The words sent a jolt of fear through Evelyn, and for a brief, fleeting moment, she caught a glimpse of something beneath the figure's hood. A flash of pale, lifeless skin stretched over bone, like a corpse that had been brought back to life. A wave of nausea surged in her stomach as the figure stepped closer, its feet never making a sound against the stone floor. Her mind raced, trying to understand, but before she could form a coherent thought, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but the chilling silence behind. She gasped, her breath coming in erratic bursts as the pressure in the room seemed to ease slightly. For a moment, she stood there, paralyzed by fear, her mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. But as the adrenaline began to ebb away, she realized something. She was no longer alone in the village. She had been drawn into something far darker than she could have imagined. The whispers, the figure, the sense of dread, these were only the beginning. Determined to understand what was happening, Evelyn forced herself to move, her heart still hammering in her chest. She needed answers, and there was only one place she could think to find them, the village's local inn, or what remained of it. She had seen the building earlier when she first arrived, a dilapidated structure at the edge of the village. It was barely standing, the roof sagging and the windows shattered, but it was the only place that might hold some clue as to what was going on. As she made her way across the village, the storm outside intensified, the wind howling as though it were alive. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and every step she took seemed to echo too loudly in the silence. She passed by more of the empty buildings, each one more foreboding than the last. The doors to the houses were ajar, their interiors pitch black, as though no one had lived there in decades. The streets were eerily deserted, the only sound the rhythmic beating of the rain against the cobblestones. When Evelyn reached the inn, the door creaked open on its own as she approached, a strange invitation. The inside was even worse than she had imagined. Dust and cobwebs coated the furniture, and the air was thick with the smell of rot. But what struck her the most was the faint, eerie glow that seemed to emanate from the far corner of the room. As she stepped inside, she noticed the walls were covered with faded, yellowed newspaper clippings. Some were stuck to the walls with old tape, others pinned with rusty nails. She stepped closer, her breath catching in her throat as she read the faded headlines. Another disappearance in the village. Strange lights seen over the woods. Residents report hearing voices at night. Evelyn's heart sank as she moved closer to the articles, reading the details of each one. They were all connected to the village, detailing the strange events that had plagued it for years. People had disappeared without a trace, their bodies never found, their families left in despair. There were tales of strange, unexplainable lights in the sky, of eerie sounds heard late at night, and of a curse that the villagers whispered about in hushed tones. The last clipping, yellowed with age, was the most chilling. It was a letter, hastily scrawled, and it spoke of an ancient ritual, a pact made with something dark and otherworldly in exchange for power. As Evelyn read the words, a cold realization settled over her. The village hadn't been abandoned by choice. It had been abandoned because of the curse that bound it, something that had been unleashed long ago, something that now called the village its home. The villagers had tried to escape, but they never could. And now, it seemed, the curse had found a new victim, Evelyn. The room seemed to darken as she finished reading, the air thick with the weight of the secrets that had been hidden for so long. A sharp, piercing sound broke the silence, a cry distant but unmistakably human. Evelyn's blood ran cold as she turned toward the door, her instincts screaming at her to leave. But she knew, deep down, that escaping wasn't an option. Not anymore. Evelyn's legs felt heavy as she stumbled out of the inn, the weight of what she had just discovered pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. The village, once just an empty stretch of forgotten houses, now felt alive with a sinister energy that seemed to pulse beneath the cracked stone streets, beneath the rotting facades of the buildings. She couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to step too far out of line. As she walked back toward the center of the village, her mind whirring with the knowledge she had just uncovered, the atmosphere around her seemed to change. The wind, which had been howling relentlessly just moments before, now died down to an eerie whisper. The rain had slowed to a soft drizzle, but the streets were still slick, gleaming under the faint glow of the dying streetlights. Everything felt different, unnaturally still, like the calm before a storm. It was then that she noticed something strange. At first, it was just a flicker at the edge of her vision, a brief movement in the shadows of the buildings lining the street. But as she paused to take it in, she realized it wasn't just her imagination playing tricks on her. There was something, or rather, someone lurking in the darkness just out of sight. The figure was too fast to focus on, too fleeting to fully make out, but Evelyn could feel it. Her skin prickled with an all-encompassing sense of dread, and her heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, unsure of what to do. She quickly turned away and continued walking, but the sensation of being followed never left her. Every step she took felt heavier, the ground beneath her feet seemingly pulling her down as though the earth itself wanted to keep her in place. Her breathing became shallow, her hands trembling at her sides. The further she walked, the stronger the feeling of being watched grew. She could feel eyes, cold, malevolent eyes, boring into her back, following her every movement. She tried to tell herself it was just her nerves, the stress of the situation, but deep down, she knew it was something far more sinister. She rounded a corner and stopped dead in her tracks. Standing at the far end of the street, barely visible through the mist that had begun to roll in, was the same figure she had seen in the church. The figure was dressed in a dark cloak that billowed in the wind, and though it stood motionless, its very presence seemed to ripple through the air, distorting the space around it. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the figure, the same wave of cold terror washing over her that she had felt earlier. But this time, the figure didn't vanish. It stood there unmoving, just waiting. "Leave." The figure spoke again, its voice like the creak of old wood, rough and distorted. "Leave before it's too late." Evelyn's mind raced. Who was this person, and what did they want? Was this some kind of twisted warning? But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring, as though waiting for her to make the next move. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get out of the village while she still had the chance, but something deep within her, refused to let her give in. She had to know more. She had to uncover the truth behind the curse that hung over this place like a dark cloud. Summoning all the courage she could muster, Evelyn took a tentative step forward. The figure didn't react, but the air around her seemed to grow even colder, the shadows deepening as she drew closer. She could feel the weight of the presence pressing in on her, as though the very ground she walked on was beginning to buckle under the weight of some unseen force. As she took another step, a sharp sound broke the silence, a loud crack that echoed down the street, causing Evelyn to jump in fright. She spun around, heart racing, to find nothing but the same empty streets behind her. But when she turned back to face the figure, it was gone. The street, once filled with the oppressive presence of the figure, was now eerily quiet, as though it had never been there at all. A chill ran down Evelyn's spine. What had just happened? Was she losing her mind, or was something far more terrifying at play? She looked around, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts, but there was no sign of the figure. The village was silent, unnervingly so, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. With a shaky breath, Evelyn forced herself to continue walking, determined to find answers. She couldn't stay in the village forever, but she needed to understand what had happened to the people here, why they had vanished, and what dark force held them in its grip. Her mind was racing, each thought tangled in a web of fear and uncertainty, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't leave until she had uncovered the truth. The oppressive atmosphere around her seemed to close in as she walked, the shadows stretching long and dark across the cobblestones. The buildings around her appeared even more dilapidated now, the broken windows casting ghostly reflections of the fog that had begun to settle over the village. It was as though the village itself had come alive, responding to her presence, drawing her deeper into its dark heart. As Evelyn continued down the narrow streets, she could feel the temperature drop even further, her breath visible in the air as a thick fog began to swirl around her feet. The mist seemed to come from nowhere, rolling in like a living entity, winding through the alleys and curling around the buildings like fingers reaching out to drag her into the unknown. She glanced over her shoulder once more, but there was nothing, no figure, no movement. Yet, despite the apparent silence, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Every corner she turned, every creaking of the wood beneath her feet, sent a ripple of unease through her. Then, as she neared an old, abandoned store, a low whispering sound reached her ears, so faint that she almost dismissed it as the wind. But it grew louder, more distinct, as though the very walls of the village were speaking to her. The whispers were soft at first, incomprehensible, like voices from another world, but they soon became clearer. Each word sent a chill through her spine. "Help us find us." The whispering came from every direction now, surrounding her, echoing through the narrow street. Evelyn's heart raced as she spun around, her eyes wide with fear, but there was no one there. The voices, the presence, it was all around her, but when she looked, she saw nothing. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching toward her with twisted, elongated limbs, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they became a cacophony of pleading voices. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped. The village fell into silence once more, as though it had never been alive in the first place. Evelyn's mind was reeling. Had she imagined it? Was she starting to lose touch with reality? Or was the village truly alive, with a dark presence that wanted her to become a part of its endless nightmare? With no answers and no way to escape, Evelyn pressed on, her every step weighed down by the strange, unseen forces that tugged at her very soul. The oppressive atmosphere of the village had already begun to wear on Evelyn's nerves. She could feel her sanity slowly slipping away with each passing moment, the strange occurrences and the eerie silence pressing on her mind like a vice. Each night, as the village seemed to close around her, the walls between the real and the unreal grew thinner, until she could no longer trust her own perceptions. Sleep was no relief. It was filled with nightmares that blurred the line between dreams and reality, where faces from the village's past would appear to her in the dark, their eyes hollow, their lips moving without sound. Evelyn would wake in a cold sweat, heart racing, only to find that nothing had changed. The village remained as dead and lifeless as ever. Every corner she turned, the shadows grew deeper, the silence more suffocating. The days bled into one another, indistinguishable from one another, as though time itself had become warped by the dark presence that hung over the village. Evelyn found herself losing track of time. Was it morning or night? It was impossible to tell. The sun never seemed to rise properly, and the air was always thick with fog, casting everything in an unearthly twilight. The village, once quaint and peaceful, had become a labyrinth of madness, each street a mirror of her crumbling mind. The feeling of being watched had never left her. At first, she thought it was the paranoia of being in a strange, forsaken place, but now it was different. Now it felt like something far more sinister, something actively observing her every move. It wasn't just the figure in the shadows anymore, it was everything. The buildings, the trees, the very ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with a dark life of its own, breathing in rhythm with her heartbeat, as if it was feeding off her fear. The pressure mounted until she could no longer tell if it was the village itself or her own spiraling thoughts that were causing her to lose her grip on reality. Evelyn's footsteps echoed through the deserted streets as she walked in a daze, her thoughts fractured and disjointed. She no longer knew if she was searching for something or running from it. It was as if the boundaries between the two had become meaningless. She stumbled upon the village square again, the same place where she had first arrived, but now it felt different. The fountain, which had been dry and broken when she first saw it, was now flowing, though the water was black as ink, swirling with an unnatural, oily sheen. Evelyn felt an overwhelming urge to approach it, drawn to its dark depths like a moth to a flame. But as she drew closer, she hesitated. A voice, soft and low, whispered from behind her. "Do you see it yet?" Evelyn froze, her blood running cold. She spun around, her heart thundering in her chest, but once again, there was no one there. The square was empty, save for the creeping fog that seemed to cling to every surface, curling around the stone walls like a living thing. The whisper came again, this time louder, closer. It seemed to come from everywhere, from the very air around her. "Do you understand now? You belong here, Evelyn. This is your home. It always has been." The words echoed in her ears, sending a shiver of dread down her spine. She had never heard the voice before, but it felt so familiar, so intimate. It felt as though it was speaking directly to her mind, bypassing her ears entirely. The voice seemed to invade her thoughts, twisting her perception, clouding her judgment. As the whispering continued, Evelyn felt a pull in her chest, an overwhelming desire to return to the inn, to the place where the dark truths of the village had begun to unravel. The desire was so strong that it was like a physical force, tugging at her very soul. She fought it, but the more she resisted, the more it grew. The world around her began to warp, the buildings stretching and shifting in unnatural ways, the sky darkening, the shadows lengthening until they consumed everything. The lines between what was real and what was illusion dissolved, and Evelyn found herself standing on the edge of something vast and unfathomable, like she was teetering on the brink of an abyss. The fog thickened, swirling around her legs as the air grew heavier, suffocating. Evelyn took a step forward, her vision blurring, her head pounding with the weight of the voice's words. She could feel the darkness seeping into her veins, as if the village itself was rooting itself in her very being. The shadows stretched out, reaching for her, wrapping around her limbs, pulling her deeper into their cold embrace. Without warning, Evelyn's legs gave way, and she collapsed to her knees, gasping for air as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. They were no longer just words. They were visions, fragmented images of the village's past, its twisted history coming to life in her mind. She saw the villagers, their faces contorted in terror as they were dragged into the depths of the earth by some unseen force, their screams echoing through the empty streets. She saw the ritual, the pact that had been made long ago, a blood-soaked ceremony that had sealed the village's fate, binding it to an ancient, malevolent force that fed on fear and despair. She saw herself, her face twisted in agony as she became part of the village's dark legacy, her soul trapped in a never-ending cycle of torment. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Evelyn could see her breath in front of her. She could feel her mind unraveling, her sense of self fading away as the village's secrets consumed her. The boundaries between her past and present blurred, as though time itself was losing its grip. She was no longer just a visitor to this place. She was part of it, woven into its fabric, its history, and its curse. A dark figure appeared in front of her, its shape vague and indistinct, but its presence undeniable. It loomed over her, its cold eyes fixed on hers, as though it could see into the very core of her being. The figure didn't speak, it didn't need to. Its silence was a condemnation, a reminder that Evelyn had already crossed a line from which there was no return. The figure reached down and placed a hand on her forehead, its touch freezing cold, like ice against her skin. The moment it made contact, a surge of memories flooded Evelyn's mind, flashes of lives lived and lost, of deals made and broken, of promises that could never be undone. Evelyn screamed, but no sound came out. She opened her mouth, but it was as though her voice had been stolen. The darkness pressed in, suffocating her, until all she could see was the cold, unfeeling eyes of the figure. It was then that she understood. The village had claimed her, just as it had claimed everyone else before her. She was a part of its twisted history, bound to it in ways that defied understanding. The curse wasn't just a curse, it was a trap, one that had been set long ago, and Evelyn had walked right into it, as all the others had before her. The figure withdrew its hand, and Evelyn collapsed to the ground, trembling, her body racked with cold. She was lost. There was no escape now. She was part of the village, and the village was part of her. And as the darkness closed in, she understood that there was no salvation. There was only the endless, suffocating cycle of fear and madness. Evelyn's mind was a fog of confusion and despair, her every thought tangled in the web of the village's dark history. She felt as though the world itself had collapsed around her, and the very air she breathed was saturated with the weight of secrets. Secrets she was never meant to know, secrets that had been buried in the heart of the village for centuries. The village had consumed her, and she could feel its cold fingers tightening around her soul, dragging her deeper into its abyss. But there was something else, something that gnawed at the edges of her consciousness. A faint memory, a whisper from the past, kept echoing in her mind. Something she had seen, something she had missed. In her moments of clarity, she could almost remember what it was. The thought was elusive, slipping through her grasp like water between her fingers, but it was there, lurking in the shadows of her mind. In the dead of night, as the village held its breath in the suffocating silence, Evelyn's restless sleep was interrupted by a sharp, piercing noise. It was like the sound of something scratching against stone, something trying to break through the very fabric of reality itself. Evelyn shot up from her bed, her heart pounding, her mind racing. She knew the sound. It was the same sound she had heard when she first arrived, when the village had begun to reveal its true nature. But now it was different. Louder. Closer. She could feel the presence of something behind her, something watching her from the shadows, just out of sight. Her heart hammered in her chest as she slowly turned around, her eyes wide with fear. The room was empty, save for the flickering candlelight and the creeping shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls like living things. She held her breath, straining to hear, but the scratching had stopped. Only silence remained. But then a voice, familiar, yet distant, whispered in the darkness. "The truth, you must see it." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She recognized the voice. It was the same voice that had haunted her dreams, the one that had whispered in her ear, urging her to stay, to learn the village's dark secrets. But now, the voice had a new edge to it, a harshness that sent chills down her spine. It was not a comforting voice, it was a warning. Evelyn stood, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and determination. She had to find out what was happening here. She had to uncover the truth, no matter how dark or twisted it was. With slow, measured steps, she moved toward the door, her every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But she ignored it, forcing herself to open the door and step into the cold, fog-shrouded streets once more. As she walked through the village, the fog grew thicker, obscuring her vision, making it feel as though she was walking through a dream, a nightmare. The buildings loomed over her, their broken windows like hollow eyes, watching her every move. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, closing in on all sides, as if the village itself were alive, responding to her presence. She felt the weight of something ancient pressing down on her, a force older than time itself, and with each step she took, she felt herself being pulled deeper into its grip. She reached the center of the village, where the fountain had once flowed with dark, oily water. But now the fountain was dry, its stone basin cracked and broken, the remains of what had once been a source of life now a desolate, hollow shell. The air around her was heavy with a strange energy, a palpable force that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her own heartbeat. It was as though the village itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then she saw it. In the distance, barely visible through the fog, a figure stood. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, its face obscured by a hood. But Evelyn didn't need to see the face. She knew who it was, the same figure that had warned her, that had haunted her every step. It was the figure that had been watching her since the moment she arrived in the village, the one that had guided her toward the dark truths, toward the final revelation. Without a word, the figure turned and began to walk, its movements slow and deliberate. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She followed, her feet moving on their own as though they were being guided by some unseen force. The fog thickened around her, closing in like a prison, but still she followed. The figure led her down a narrow alleyway, toward the heart of the village, toward the place where it had all begun. The alley opened up into a small courtyard, surrounded by crumbling stone walls. At the center of the courtyard was an ancient, weathered door, its wood rotting with age, its iron hinges rusted and decayed. The figure stopped in front of the door and turned to face Evelyn, its cold eyes gleaming from beneath the hood. "Do you see it now?" the figure asked, its voice low and gravelly, as though it had been dragged from the depths of the earth. "Do you understand the cost?" Evelyn's breath caught in her throat as the figure reached out and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the stillness, as if the very act of opening the door was disturbing something ancient, something that had been sealed away for far too long. Beyond the door was a dark passage, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. As she stepped inside, Evelyn could feel the temperature drop, the cold sinking into her bones, chilling her to the core. The walls of the passage were covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the stone like some forgotten language. The symbols pulsed with a faint, eerie glow, as though they were alive, feeding off the energy around them. She continued down the passage, her every step echoing in the silence, until she reached the end. At the far wall, there was a large stone altar, covered in dust and cobwebs, but it was clear that it had once been used for something far darker. The air was thick with the weight of ancient rituals, of sacrifices and blood. Evelyn's heart raced as she approached the altar, her eyes drawn to the strange markings etched into its surface. And then she saw it, the truth that had been hidden from her all this time. The altar was covered in blood. Fresh blood. Evelyn recoiled, her stomach turning, but her eyes couldn't look away. There, in the center of the altar, was a symbol, one that she recognized from the village's history, from the old texts she had found in the inn. It was the same symbol that had appeared in her dreams, the one that had haunted her thoughts. It was a symbol of binding, a mark of sacrifice, one that had been used to trap souls, to feed a dark, ancient force that had bound the village to its will. And in that moment, Evelyn understood. The village wasn't just cursed, it was alive. It was a living, breathing entity, and the people who had once inhabited it were its sustenance. They had been sacrificed, bound to the land to feed the force that had taken hold of this place. And now, Evelyn was no different. She had been drawn into the web, trapped in the same way, bound to the village's dark purpose. Her blood, her very soul, would be the next offering. The realization hit her like a thunderclap, the truth washing over her in a wave of horror and despair. There was no escape. The village had claimed her, just as it had claimed all those before her, and there would be no end to the cycle. The force that held the village in its grip was too strong, too ancient. Evelyn was already part of it, her fate sealed the moment she set foot in this cursed place. With a final, chilling whisper, the figure spoke again. "It is done." Evelyn's scream echoed through the darkness, but there was no one left to hear it. Evelyn stood in the center of the dark, oppressive chamber, her heart pounding in her chest as the realization of her fate settled in. The cold, suffocating air wrapped around her like a vice, and the world outside, the village she had once thought of as a strange, forgotten place, now felt as though it were closing in on her. The truth was undeniable now. She wasn't just trapped in this cursed village. She had become part of it. The entity, the darkness that had consumed the land, had already begun its claim on her soul, and no matter how she tried to resist, she could feel it growing stronger, burrowing deeper into her being, intertwining with her very essence. Her mind raced, flooded with images of the faces of the lost villagers, their hollow eyes staring at her in silent accusation. Their spirits were trapped, bound to this place by the dark force that held dominion over the land. They were lost forever, consumed by the same fate that now loomed over her. The village had been a prison, but it was also something more, a living, breathing force, a predator that devoured the souls of those foolish enough to wander too close. Evelyn's breath came in shallow gasps as she struggled to hold on to her sanity. Her skin crawled as the air around her seemed to thrum with an energy that made her skin burn. She could feel the presence of something darker now, something that moved just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. It was the force that controlled the village, the entity that fed on fear, on despair. And now it was coming for her, drawn by her confusion, her helplessness, her terror. Her legs felt weak, but she refused to fall. She couldn't afford to give in, not yet. There had to be something she could do, some way to escape this nightmare before it consumed her entirely. She had fought so hard to uncover the truth, to understand what was happening in this forsaken place. But now, the truth seemed more like a curse than a revelation. There was no easy answer, no escape. The figure, the one who had guided her here, had disappeared into the darkness. It was as though it had never been there at all, a mere shadow of the force that controlled the village. Evelyn had no idea who or what it truly was, but she understood now that it was merely a servant of the ancient entity, a puppet of the darkness. The real power, the real danger, was something far older, far more malevolent. The walls of the chamber seemed to pulse with life, the symbols etched into the stone glowing with a dim, sickly light. The very air felt thick with the weight of ancient power. It was as though the land itself was alive, aware of her presence and eager to claim her. She could feel the ground beneath her feet shifting, as though the earth itself was awakening, stirring, ready to devour her. The village was a trap, and she was its final prey. But in the pit of her stomach, Evelyn could feel something else, a spark of defiance. Even as her strength waned, even as the darkness crept closer, she clung to that fragile thread of resistance. She would not let herself be consumed by this place. She would fight, even if it meant her end. In the distance, the faintest sound reached her ears, a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. She turned, her heart racing, her eyes scanning the shadows. It was a voice, but not the voice she had heard before. This voice was different. It was ancient, filled with power, and it came from deep within the earth, from the very heart of the village. Evelyn could feel it vibrating through her bones, a low, guttural sound that seemed to resonate with the darkness itself. "Welcome home," the voice rumbled. The words sent a shock through her body, as if a bolt of ice had been driven into her chest. The voice was not just speaking to her, it was speaking through her, claiming her. Evelyn staggered back, her hands pressing against the cold stone wall as she tried to steady herself, but it was no use. The force that had been lurking in the shadows was finally revealing itself, and it was stronger than anything she had ever known. The air thickened, and the shadows around her began to writhe, twisting and curling like living things. The ground beneath her feet cracked open, revealing a deep chasm that seemed to lead into the very bowels of the earth. From within the depths of the chasm, Evelyn could hear the unmistakable sound of something moving, something vast and monstrous waiting to rise. It was the thing that had controlled this village for centuries, the entity that had consumed all those who had lived here, and now it was reaching for her. Evelyn stumbled backward, her mind reeling as she tried to make sense of the horror unfolding around her. She had no weapons, no means of defending herself against the ancient force that was about to claim her. She was powerless, but the terror inside her began to shift. What if there was something she could do? What if the power of the village, the force that had consumed so many before her, could be turned against itself? The chasm deepened, and the shadows grew darker, colder. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and Evelyn could feel the pressure building, the weight of centuries of bloodshed and death pressing in on her. The very fabric of reality seemed to be unraveling, as if the world itself was being consumed by the entity's hunger. In the darkest corner of her mind, a thought began to take root. If this place was built on fear, if the entity was fed by the terror and suffering of those it had claimed, then perhaps that was the key. Perhaps it wasn't her resistance that could stop it, but her acceptance. She had to let go, to surrender herself to the darkness, not with fear, but with defiance. She had to turn her terror into something else. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in on her, and the voice grew louder, more insistent. "You belong to me. You always have." Evelyn's heart raced, but she forced herself to take a deep breath, pushing the panic from her mind. She had nothing left to lose. With a defiant cry, she stepped forward into the darkness, into the chasm, her arms spread wide. Her body shuddered as the shadows engulfed her, but instead of succumbing to the terror, she embraced it, accepting the power of the ancient force, allowing it to flow through her veins, feeling the overwhelming cold of its presence. She felt the energy of the village, of the entity, course through her, its hunger, its power, its endless desire to consume. And in that moment, she understood. She wasn't just a victim. She was part of the cycle. She had become the vessel for the entity's dark purpose. The shadows roared around her, and the earth trembled as the village seemed to come alive, shifting and changing, the walls of the chamber cracking and splitting as the entity awakened fully. Evelyn felt herself merge with the darkness, her soul consumed, her will shattered. The village had won, as it always did, and Evelyn was no longer Evelyn. She was the village. The last thing she heard was the voice, now in her mind, whispering the final words she would ever hear. "You are mine.